the Nevada desert stretched out in a vast ochre expanse, broken only by the occasional scrub brush, and the long straight line of State Route 375 the extraterrestrial highway. Alex Vance rolled down the window of his rented sedan, letting the dry, heat-baked air wash over him. It carried the scent of dust and creosote, a smell that felt ancient and isolated. He was a long way from his tidy office at the Chronicle, chasing a story that most of his colleagues would dismiss as fringe nonsense. But Alex wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was an investigator. His Pulitzer nomination for exposing a corporate cover-up was proof of that. He pursued facts, not fantasies. Area 51, however, was a legend built on the deliberate absence of facts. And that absence was the very thing that drew him. His destination, the town of Rachel, was less a town and more a stubborn outpost, clinging to the edge of the desert. A handful of sun-bleached buildings, a small cluster of homes, and the reason for his drive. The little alien. The building was exactly as he'd imagined. A low-slung structure painted a fading sky blue, its iconic alien murals weathered by sand and sun. A few rental cars and a dusty pickup truck were parked outside. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of fried food and old wood. The decor was a cheerful, kitschy tribute to the unknown. Alien figurines, framed UFO photographs of dubious authenticity, the map of the solar system on the ceiling. The patrons were a mix of obvious tourists in bright polo shirts and a few locals who looked carved from the desert itself. Their faces leathered, their eyes holding a quiet, knowing reserve. Alex took a seat at the bar, ordering a coffee. He made casual conversation with the bartender, a woman with a tired smile named Darlene, mentioning he was a writer interested in local history. It was a careful, practiced approach. He didn't lead with Area 51. He let them lead him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone shifted. A rancher nursing a beer at the end of the bar mentioned the strange quiet that sometimes fell over the desert at night. Another, an older man with hands like worn leather, spoke of lights that moved in ways that defied explanation. Sharp, right-angled turns, impossible accelerations. Their voices never rose above a murmur, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the door or the windows, as if out of habit. It wasn't melodramatic secrecy. It was the ingrained caution of people who lived in the shadow of a place that officially did not exist. They spoke of friends who had gotten too curious, who had asked too many questions, only to be paid quiet visits by polite, unsmiling men in dark sedans. The stories were a blend of personal experience, community folklore, and a deep, vague unease that had settled over the landscape like dust. Alex listened, his reporter's notebook on his knee under the bar, jotting down sparse, efficient notes. He felt the weight of the legend pressing in, a tangible force in the hushed tones and wary glances. It was a powerful narrative, one that could easily sweep a less disciplined mind away. But Alex felt the familiar anchor of his skepticism. These were stories, compelling and eerie, but still just stories. He needed evidence. He needed a witness. As he paid his bill and stepped back out into the blinding desert sun, the silence felt heavier, the vast emptiness more profound. The mystery of Groom Lake was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical presence, and his journalistic instincts, honed and skeptical, were fully, irrevocably engaged. The Barker Ranch was a 20-minute drive from the Little Alien, down a dirt road that seemed to lead further into a timeless, sun-scorched isolation. The property was a testament to stubborn endurance. A modest, single-story house with a faded tin roof, a weather-beaten barn, and a few head of cattle standing motionless in the heat. Alex Vance parked his sedan next to a dusty pickup truck, the crunch of gravel under his tire sounding unnaturally loud in the immense quiet. Clyde Barker answered the door himself. He was a man in his late 70s, with a frame that was still solid but had begun to stoop under the weight of decades of hard labor. His face was a road map of deep wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue that held a direct, no-nonsense gaze. He wore faded denim overalls, and his handshake was calloused and firm. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Not much to look at, but it's cool." The interior of the house was sparse and orderly. The furniture was old but well cared for, and the air smelled of coffee and wood polish. On the mantelpiece, among framed photographs of family, sat a model of a classic John Deere tractor. There were no alien trinkets, no UFO posters. This was not the home of a fantasist. Alex accepted a mug of black coffee and sat at the kitchen table, setting his digital recorder between them. "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, Mr. Barker." "Clyde's fine," the rancher said, settling into the chair opposite with a soft groan. "And I ain't doing it for the time. I'm doing it because it happened. Simple as that." He spoke without preamble, his story delivered in the flat, factual tone of a man recounting a cattle count or a broken fence. It was the winter of '87, a clear, cold night. He'd been out checking on a pregnant heifer in the north pasture. "Wasn't a sound," Clyde began, his eyes losing focus, looking past Alex at the memory. No wind, not even the crickets, just dead quiet. That was the first thing that was wrong. Then we saw the lights, not the running lights of a plane. 3 steady, soft white lights forming a perfect, massive triangle, moving silently over the ridge line. It was gliding, but its movement was all wrong. "It didn't fly," Clyde said, his voice dropping, becoming more intent. "Slid, like it was on ice. No banking, no engine roar, no vapor trail. Nothing." It made a 90-degree turn without slowing down. Just turned. "Physics don't work that way." Alex listened, his pen pausing over his notepad. He noted the sensory details, the profound silence, the unnatural movement, the eerie, non-blinking light. These were concrete observations, not the ramblings of someone seeing little green men. It hung there for a minute, maybe 2, Clyde continued, just hovering. Then it shot off to the east. Didn't accelerate. 1 second it was there. The next, it was just a dot. Then gone. Faster than a blink. He fell silent, taking a long sip of his coffee. The memory had visibly drained him. That was it. Took less than a minute. But it changes you. You see something like that, something that shouldn't be, and the world don't feel so solid anymore. Couldn't sleep right for months. Started seeing every car on the horizon as one of theirs. Alex leaned forward slightly. Theirs? Clyde's jaw tightened. The ones who came after. But that's for another cup of coffee. Alex nodded, switching off the recorder. He had pages of notes, a vivid, unsettling account that defied easy explanation. It was detailed, sensory, and grounded in the reality of a man who valued facts as much as he did. Alex's skepticism remained a trick of the light, a secret aircraft, but it was now wrestling with the raw, undeniable conviction in the old rancher's weary eyes. Clyde refilled both their mugs, the steady pour of coffee, the only sound in the quiet kitchen for a long moment. He sat back down, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if steeling himself. 3 days later, he began, his voice lowered now, stripped of the ore that had colored his description of the craft. 3 black sedans, government plates. Didn't come roaring up, just pulled into the yard real slow, real quiet. Like they owned the place. 4 men got out. They were all cut from the same cloth. Dark, impeccably tailored suits that looked absurd against the dusty ranch backdrop. They were clean-shaven, their expressions neutral, almost bored. They didn't brandish badges or weapons. They didn't need to. They were polite. Cold but polite, Clyde said, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. Knew my name. Knew about the heifer. Knew I'd been out on the north pasture that Tuesday night. One of them did all the talking. Said I'd witnessed a test of a new atmospheric reconnaissance platform. Said it was a matter of national security. The man's tone was not threatening. It was matter of fact, bureaucratic. He explained that discussing what Clyde had seen would be a violation of the Espionage Act. He outlined the potential consequences, not with menace, but with the dry certainty of a man reading from a legal statute. Hefty fines, federal imprisonment, the seizure of his land for a security buffer zone. They didn't shout, didn't make a single threat you could pin down in a court of law. Clyde murmured, just laid it all out, made it clear that my life, this ranch, everything I built, it was conditional on my silence. They asked if I understood. I said I did. Then they left. Just like that. The silence they left behind was heavier than the one that had preceded the triangle. It was the silence of isolation, of knowing a truth you could never share, of living with an invisible fence around your life. Clyde's friends and neighbors, sensing the shift, gave him wide berth. The event had stolen his peace. The visit had stolen his community. But I kept something, Clyde said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old defiance. He pushed back his chair and walked to an old metal tool cabinet in the corner. From behind a box of worn wrenches, he pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it on the table between them and carefully unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a shard of metal, about the size of a guitar pick. It was unlike any metal Alex had ever seen. It was a dull, non-reflective gray, but with a faint, almost oily iridescence when the light hit it just right. It felt unnaturally heavy for its size, cool to the touch, but not cold, and its edges were smooth, as if melted and polished. Found it the next morning, right where the damn thing hovered, Clyde said. They never asked about it. Probably figured it burned up. Or that I was too scared to even look. Keeping it felt like keeping a piece of my sanity. Proof I wasn't crazy. Alex picked up the shard. Its weight was indeed surprising. Its texture smooth and almost glass-like. It was a physical object, a tangible piece of an impossible puzzle. He felt a chill, but it was the chill of a journalist who has just been handed a potential key, not of a man facing immediate danger. His mind was already working, analyzing. Composition, density, origin. This wasn't a story anymore. It was evidence. Thank you for showing me this, Clyde, Alex said, his tone professional, respectful. He rewrapped the shard and placed it in his own pocket. I'll be discreet. Clyde just nodded, his gaze distant again. The act of sharing his secret seemed to have hollowed him out once more. Driving away from the ranch, the vast desert seemed to watch him. Alex's fingers brushed against the cloth-wrapped shard in his jacket pocket. The men in suits were reading, Their reach was real, and he now held a piece of something that defied all of Dr. Evans's rational theories. His first instinct wasn't fear, but verification. He needed to get this analyzed. The mystery of Groom Lake had just become profoundly, undeniably physical. The air in the lost team stuck. The air in the lost team. Vegas branch of the National Archives was cool, dry, and carried the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper. The smell of history slowly surrendering to time. Alex Vance sat at a solid oak table, a pool of light from a green-shaded lamp illuminating the space in front of him. Stacks of gray archival boxes surrounded him, each labeled with cryptic numerical codes. He had traded the vast, open silence of the desert for the hushed, bureaucratic quiet of the record room. His focus was a recently declassified file from the CIA's Historical Review Program, referenced as U2 Historical Summary, Project Aquatone, 1954 to 1974. The cover sheet was stamped with a dozen different classification markers, most of them now crossed out with thick black lines. The body of the document was a masterclass in obfuscation. He read through dry, technical prose about high-altitude photographic reconnaissance, the development of special camera systems, and the challenges of flying over denied territories. The language was sterile, devoid of any drama. And then, buried in a paragraph about operational bases, he found it. A single, oblique reference to the facility at Groom Lake, Nevada. His pulse quickened. This was it official, albeit reluctant, acknowledgement. But the sentence that followed was a blacked-out canyon. The purpose of the facility, the nature of the work conducted there, the specific projects, all were redacted with impersonal, perfect rectangles of ink. The next page was worse. Whole paragraphs were obliterated. He felt a journalist's frustration, a slow-burning irritation at this deliberate, institutional silence. Each black bar felt less like the protection of secrets, and more like a taunt. He cross-referenced the document with others from the same era budgetary reports, memos on security protocols. Pattern was consistent. Groom Lake was mentioned, its existence no longer deniable, but its heart was surgically removed from the record. A memo discussing aerial phenomena reports from civilian pilots concluded that many could be attributed to testing of new capability platforms. But the specific platforms were, of course, redacted. Alex leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The sterile, factual language of the documents was a world away from Clyde Barker's visceral account of silent triangles and cold-suited men. Yet they were part of the same story. The government's version was a skeleton, all structure, no flesh. It acknowledged the bone, but redacted the blood and sinew that gave it life and purpose. This wasn't just secrecy. It was the careful cultivation of a mystery. By admitting the base existed but scrubbing clean its reason for being, they fueled more speculation than they quelled. He closed the final folder, the rational part of his mind. The part that had been swayed by Doctor to being swayed by Doctor. Evans's black jet theory understood the need for military secrecy. But the journalist in him, the investigator, saw the gaps in the official narrative. The redactions were too broad, too absolute. They didn't just hide aircraft specs. They hid a reality. He was no closer to knowing what flew over Clyde's ranch, but he was now acutely aware of the immense, impersonal wall of bureaucracy and silence that had been erected to ensure he never would. The trail hadn't ended. It had simply vanished into a forest of black ink. The air in the Las Vegas branch of the National Archives was cool, dry, and carried the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper. a smell of history slowly surrendering to time. Alex Vance sat at a solid oak table, a pool of light from a green-shaded lamp illuminating the space in front of him. Stacks of gray archival boxes surrounded him, each labeled with cryptic numerical codes. He had traded the vast, open silence of the desert for the hush, bureaucratic quiet of the record room. His focus was a recently declassified file from the CIA's Historical Review Program, referenced as U2 Historical Summary Project Aquatel, 1954 to 1974. The cover sheet was stamped with a dozen different classification markers, most of them now crossed out with thick black lines. The body of the document was a masterclass in obfuscation. He read through dry, technical prose about high-altitude photographic reconnaissance, the development of special camera systems, and the challenges of flying over denied territories. The language was sterile, devoid of any drama. And then, buried in a paragraph about operational bases, he found it, a single oblique reference to the facility at Groom Lake, Nevada. His pulse quickened. This was it official, albeit reluctant, acknowledgement. But the sentence that followed was a blacked-out canyon. The purpose of the facility, the nature of the work conducted there, the specific projects, all the redacted with impersonal, perfect rectangles of ink. The next page was worse. Whole paragraphs were obliterated. He felt a journalist's frustration, a slow-burning irritation at this deliberate, institutional silence. Each black bar felt less like the protection of secrets and more like a taunt. He cross-referenced the document with others from the same era budgetary reports, memos on security protocols. The pattern was consistent. Groom Lake was mentioned, its existence no longer deniable, but its heart was surgically removed from the record. A memo discussing aerial phenomena reports from civilian pilots concluded that many could be attributed to testing of new capability platforms, but the specific platforms were, of course, redacted. Alex leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The sterile, factual language of the documents was a world away from Clyde Barker's visceral account of silent triangles and cold-suited men. Yet, they were part of the same story. The government's version was a skeleton ball structure, no flesh. It acknowledged the bone, but redacted the blood and sinew that gave it life and purpose. This wasn't just secrecy. It was the careful cultivation of a mystery. By admitting the base existed, but scrubbing clean its reason for being, they fueled more speculation than they quelled. He closed the final folder. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been swayed by Doctor to being swayed by Doctor. Evans's black jet theory understood the need for military secrecy, but the journalist in him, the investigator, saw the gaps in Dien. Chapter 1, the official narrative. The redactions were too broad, too absolute. They didn't just hide aircraft specs. They hid a reality. He was no closer to knowing what flew over Clyde's ranch, but he was now acutely aware of the immense, impersonal wall of bureaucracy and silence that had been erected to ensure he never would. The trail hadn't ended. It had simply vanished into a forest of black ink. Harris Evans's home office was a shrine to aeronautical history. Blueprints of legendary aircraft were framed on the walls, alongside models of the U-2 Dragon Lady and the SR-71. Blackbird rendered in precise detail. The retired aerospace engineer himself was a man of crisp diction and measured gestures, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He greeted Alex with a firm handshake and offered him a seat beside a bookshelf overflowing with technical manuals and declassified project histories. The simplest explanation is often the correct one, Mr. Vance. Evans began, steepling his fingers. The human mind, when confronted with the unfamiliar, tends toward the spectacular. But the reality is usually far more mundane and far more impressive in its own right. He launched into a concise, articulate explanation. He described the development of the U-2 in the 1950s, an aircraft designed to fly at altitudes previously thought unreachable above 70,000 feet, to a commercial pilot cruising at 20,000 feet. Evans said the sun glinting off the U-2's wings would appear as a stationary, brilliant light high in the stratosphere, unidentified, unnerving. He then detailed the SR-71 Blackbird, its sleek, otherworldly shape and staggering speed Mach 3, over 2,200 miles per hour. Its engine inlets were unlike anything else in the sky. At certain angles, they could create unusual light reflections or plasma sheets that might be misinterpreted, and its performance characteristics, rapid climbs, high-speed turns, would defy a civilian observer's understanding of physics. Evans spoke with the calm authority of a man who had helped design the very machines he described. He presented declassified performance charts and altitude graphs, grounding his theory in hard, verifiable data. He explained how the culture of extreme secrecy surrounding these projects naturally bred speculation. If the government wouldn't admit these aircraft existed, then of course the public would invent more extraordinary explanations for the things they saw. Alex listened intently, taking notes. It was a compelling, rational argument. It neatly explained the vast majority of sightings, the lights, the strange maneuvers, the government's intense secrecy. For a moment, he felt the comforting weight of Occam's razor. Clyde Barker's triangle could have been an early stealth prototype. Its bizarre flight characteristics, product of technology he couldn't comprehend. The men in suits were just security, enforcing a necessary silence. But as he left Dr. Evans's orderly home, his mind returned to the desert, to the profound, unnatural silence Clyde had described, to the cool, impossibly heavy weight of the metallic shard in his pocket, a physical artifact that felt nothing like titanium or aluminum alloy. Evans's theory was elegant and convincing, a perfectly constructed box. Yet Alex couldn't shake the feeling that Clyde's experience and the shard he carried were pieces from a different puzzle altogether. The black jet hypothesis covered a great deal of sky, but he sensed, with a journalist's nagging instinct, that it didn't cover everything. Back in his motel room, the air conditioning humming a steady, artificial chill, Alex spread his notes across the worn bedspread. Dr. Evans' theory was a clean, logical framework, and for a while, Alex had let himself slot Clyde's account and the declassified memos into its reassuring structure. The triangle was a stealth prototype. The silence, advanced propulsion. The suits, security. It almost fit. Almost. He opened a manila folder containing material he'd received from a source in the online UFO research community. A packet of scanned documents and transcribed interviews. The kind of material he usually treated with extreme skepticism. Most of it was the usual fringe noise, but one item had been flagged as credible by a few researchers he respected. A debriefing transcript of a former base security guard, one Frank Kelso, who had worked at the Groom Lake perimeter in the late 1990s. Alex had initially dismissed it, but now, after Evans, he reread it with a more critical eye. Kelso's account was dry, procedural. He spoke of shift patterns, radio protocols, and the mind-numbing boredom of watching empty desert. But one incident stood out. He described a night when a specialized custodial team, outsourced contractors with high-level clearances, was called in for an emergency cleanup in one of the main hangars, Hangar 18. A containment incident, the report had called it. Kelso's job was to secure the perimeter of the hangar while they worked. Through a crack in the hangar's massive doors, he'd caught a glimpse of the craft inside. It wasn't the angular predatory shape of a stealth bomber or the sleek cylinder of a reconnaissance plane. He described it as a dull gray disc resting on a trio of struts. But it was the side of the craft. The part the custodial team was frantically scrubbing. That seized Alex's attention. Kelso described a panel covered in markings. Not wiring diagrams, not stenciled serial numbers, or warning decals. He called them geometric, non-repeating patterns, deeply etched into the material. They looked, in his words, like hieroglyphics, but nothing from any book or museum I've ever seen. The custodial team, visibly nervous in their full hazmat gear, weren't just cleaning. They were meticulously scraping the faint, phosphorescent residue from the grooves of these symbols into sealed containers. Alex put the transcript down. He leaned back, the motel room feeling suddenly smaller. This was the flaw. This was the detail that didn't fit. Dr. Evans' world was one of titanium, radar-absorbent paint, and Mach numbers. It was a world of human engineering, however advanced. It did not include non-human hieroglyphics or biohazard cleanup crews. Why would a security guard invent such a specific, bizarre detail? A claim of alien writing was a surefire way to be labeled a crank. A story about seeing a new type of jet would have been more believable, more lucrative. Kelso had nothing to gain and everything to lose by mentioning the symbols. His tone throughout the transcript was that of a confused, slightly frightened man reporting an anomaly he couldn't process. Alex's skepticism, his journalistic shield, wrestled with the account. It was a single, uncorroborated source. It could be a hoax, a misidentification, but the specificity rang true. The hangar number, the description of the cleanup procedure, the mundane terror of the workers. It had the gritty, unglamorous texture of truth. He looked at the notes from his meeting with Dr. The notes from his meeting with Dr. Evans, then at the transcript from Frank Kelso. Two entirely different realities. The official narrative, the one Evans so eloquently defended, was a palatable half-truth. It explained the lights in the sky, but willfully ignored what might be on the ground. It was a brilliant, deliberate misdirection. Alex felt the foundation of the black jet hypothesis crack. It wasn't wrong, it was just incomplete. The government wasn't just hiding advanced aircraft. They were hiding something else entirely. Something that required a very different kind of secrecy. The name Bob Lazar was a fisher line in the world of UFO research to some, a courageous whistleblower. To others, a brilliant conman. Alex Vance approached the story with the detached methodology of a forensic accountant. He wasn't looking for truth or falsehood. He was looking for patterns, consistencies, and most importantly, verifiable details. He began with the core of Lazar's claim, that in the late 1980s, he was hired as a physicist to work on reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology at a site called S4, located south of the main Area 51 base, buried in the side of a mountain near Papoose Lake. Lazar described being shown 9 disc-shaped craft, one of which was operational. His job, he claimed, was to understand the propulsion system, which was powered by a stable isotope of a then unknown element, element 115. Alex compiled every interview Lazar had ever given, cross-referencing dates and details. The descriptions of S4 were remarkably consistent. The facility accessed via a long tunnel, individual hangars built into the mountain, an oppressive security presence that included armed guards in desert camouflage, and a private security force that seemed to operate outside standard military channels. These were specific, tangible details. A hoaxer's story often unravels under the pressure of retelling. Lazar's held its shape. Then came the inconsistencies, the holes that had dogged Lazar for decades.
His educational background was a ghost. He claimed degrees from MIT and Caltech, but neither institution had any record of a Robert Lazar attending, let alone graduating.
Lazar's explanation that his records had been erased by the government was convenient, but unprovable. His employment history was similarly murky. He said he'd been hired through a defense contractor called EG&G, but his name appeared on no payroll records that could be independently verified. Alex dug into the scientific claims. Element 115, or Muscovium, had indeed been synthesized in a lab in 2003, years after Lazar first spoke of it. Proponents saw this as vindication. Skeptics saw it as a lucky guess by a scientifically literate fabulist. Lazar's description of Kraft's gravity propulsion system using the element to generate gravity waves was theoretical in the extreme, bordering on science fiction to most mainstream physicists. He spent days in university libraries and online academic journals, speaking with physicists off the record. The consensus was clear. While Lazar used the right terminology, the overall framework he described was not considered a viable theory within the established laws of physics. It was either revolutionary genius or elaborate nonsense. Alex leaned back from his laptop, the motel room lit only by the blue glow of the screen. The Lazar dossier was a paradox. The setting felt authentic. The description of S4's layout and security had the ring of truth from someone who had seen a highly classified facility. But the protagonist's backstory was full of unverifiable claims, and the science he described was far outside the Overton window of accepted theory. He wasn't dealing with a clear-cut case. It was a choose-your-own-adventure of belief. You could focus on the compelling, ground-level details of the facility and see a man revealing the terrible truth. Or you could focus on the missing degrees and the fringe science and see a masterful hope. Alex, ever the investigator, refused to choose. Bob Lazar's story was neither a breakthrough nor a dismissal. It was a complex, deeply flawed piece of evidence. It was either the key to the whole mystery or the most compelling red herring ever created. His job was to find out which. The anonymous source had contacted Alex through a secure, encrypted email service using a burner account. The message was brief and to the point. I worked with him, not on the science, on the logistics. Can't talk long, can't use names. After a tense exchange of BGP keys and verification protocols, a time was set for a voice call through an encrypted messaging app. The voice that came through Alex's laptop speaker that night was male, middle-aged, and strained, with the faint, flat vowels of someone who'd spent years in the Southwest. There was a constant, low hum in the background, a white noise machine, Alex guessed, deployed against eavesdropping. I'm not here to talk about little green men, the voice began, its tone weary and cautious. I'm not confirming any of that. I drove a truck, a specialized hauler for sensitive materials. My clearance was for logistics and perimeter access, not for hangars. He explained his role in a convoy system that ran between the main Area 51 facility and a secondary location to the south, near Papoose Dry Lake. The route was never the same twice, and the cargo manifests were generic, listing only weights and hazmat classifications. The security for those runs was different, the source said, his voice dropping. Not air police. These were contractors, cold-eyed guys in unmarked
camo. They didn't chat. They scanned your retinas, your ID, the truck's undercarriage, every time. The checkpoint for the south site was a joke. Just a shack and a gate. But a mile down the road, there was a second checkpoint built into the rock face. That's where things got serious. That's where they transfer the cargo to internal vehicles. I never went past that second gate. Alex listened, his recorder running, his pen jotting down key details. The dual checkpoints, the contractor security, the subterranean entrance. These were concrete, observable facts about facility operations, not speculative science. They corroborated the logistical framework of Lazar's story without touching its more fantastic elements. Did you ever see a craft? Anything unusual? Alex asked, keeping his voice neutral.
A long pause.
A white noise hum. No, but I saw the stuff that went in.
Crates with radiation symbols, but also with biohazard symbols. That always struck me as odd. And the material. Once, a pallet was dropped during a transfer.
Not my truck, he added quickly as if still afraid of blame. The crate cracked open. Inside were chunks of this metal, dull gray stuff. Looked almost rocky, like ore. But the guys in the moon, suits who cleaned it up, handled it like it was red hot. And it was heavy. Unbelievably heavy for its size. They called it the feedstock. That's the only name I ever heard for it. Alex's mind went immediately to the shard in his pocket, its unnatural weight. Feedstock. A raw material. For what? The reason I'm talking to you, the source continued, his voice tightening with fear, is that the story about the guy, the physicist, that got the place right. The feel of it, the paranoia, the way they compartmentalized everything. I believe he was there. Why he was there, what he did, that I can't speak to. But the place is real, and you don't want to be on their radar. I shouldn't be doing this. They make people disappear. Not in a dramatic way. They just become unpersons. Records vanish. You never existed. The call ended abruptly, the line going dead. Alex sat in the silence of his motel room, the echo of the man's fear lingering in the air. He had not confirmed Lazar's wildest claims. He had not spoken of gravity drives or alien pilots. But he had painted a picture of a secret within a secret. A heavily guarded, separate facility with a terrifying level of operational security, handling bizarre materials under biohazard conditions. Alex felt no surge of vindication, no thrill of discovery. Instead, he felt a profound and sobering weight. The anonymous source had risked everything to confirm a sliver of the story, and his primary message was one of warning. The puzzle was becoming clearer in its outline. A hidden base, strange materials, ruthless secrecy. But its true picture was more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. He was no longer just investigating a story. He was peeling back the layers of something that was never meant to be seen. The tip came not through official channels, but through the murky backwaters of online forums, a private message from a user with a low post count and a handle that was a string of numbers. The message was brief, almost cryptic. Look at the pattern. Not just lake. Look east. Utah. The Sherman place. Same players, different game. Alex almost deleted it, dismissing it as the usual conspiratorial noise. But two words snagged his journalist's instinct. save players. He spent the next day buried.
In research, the dusty motel room transformed into a makeshift command center. Maps of Utah were spread beside his Nevada charts.
He wasn't looking for little green men. He was looking for patterns of behavior, institutional fingerprints. Skinwalker Ranch. The name itself was a magnet for the bizarre. A 512-acre property in the Uinta Basin, supposedly plagued by a relentless catalog of high strangeness since the 1990s. UFO sightings, bizarre creatures, cattle mutilations, and alleged poltergeist activity. It was easy to dismiss as a paranormal theme park, a sideshow for the credulous. But the ownership history was what caught Alex's attention. In the mid-1990s, the ranch had been purchased by Robert Bigelow, the billionaire aerospace entrepreneur whose company, Bigelow Aerospace, held multiple contracts with the U.S. government, specifically with agencies linked to advanced aerospace threat identification, the same shadowy ecosystem that surrounded Groom Lake. He dug deeper, cross-referencing dates and names.
He found reports, some from pre-Bigelow ownership, of black, unmarked helicopters seen over the ranch around the time of strange events. There were accounts of men in unmarked vehicles, dressed in casual attire, but with the unmistakable bearing of government agents, questioning locals who had witnessed phenomena.
Their methods were described as polite and firm, their questions specific and knowledgeable. It was an eerie echo of the men who had visited Clyde Barker. The phenomena themselves were different from the clean technological mystery of Area 51. Skinwalker's lore was messier, more biological, even ecological. There were reports of large, wolf-like creatures that seemed impervious to bullets, of invisible entities that generated overwhelming feelings of dread, of crops forming complex, flattened patterns. But the common thread was the intense, ongoing interest from private entities with deep government ties. Alex leaned back, rubbing his temples. He wasn't concluding that aliens were vacationing in both Nevada and Utah. That was the trap of the sensationalist. Instead, he saw a broader, more unsettling pattern. Two geographically separate locations, both hotspots of intense and inexplicable activity. Both were subjects of intense, clandestine study by private contractors operating with federal backing and a mandate for extreme secrecy. Both were places where witnesses were systematically intimidated into silence. The theory began to form in his mind, not as a wild conjecture, but as an analytical hypothesis. What if the secret of Area 51 wasn't just about recovered technology? What if it, and places like Skinwalker Ranch, were nodes in a vast, classified research network? A multi-decade, multidisciplinary study into the anomalous, whether that anomaly was supremely advanced human technology, non-human intelligence, or something entirely other that defied current classification. The goal wouldn't be cover-up for its own sake, but data acquisition. Understanding the physics of the impossible, the biology of the unknown. Groom Lake might be the engineering and reverse engineering wing. Skinwalker might be the field laboratory for a stranger, less predictable kind of phenomenon. The government's role was to fund it, protect it, and ensure its secrets remained just that. The scale of it was overwhelming. It was no longer a single base with a secret. It was a sprawling, invisible empire of secrecy, a web of research into the very edges of reality. Alex felt a familiar chill. But it was colder now, more profound. He was no longer investigating a local legend. He was staring at the contours of a national secret, of unimaginable scope. The mystery had not been solved. It had simply grown larger, deeper, and more terrifyingly complex. He was a journalist who had followed a thread, only to find it was attached to a net, and he was now hopelessly entangled in its weave.
The email arrived at 3:17 a.m. The ping of Alex's laptop, a sharp, invasive sound in the silent motel room.
He'd been asleep, his mind churning with images of Utah ranch lands, government contracts, and the noise jolted him awake with a spike of adrenaline. The sender was a random string of characters, and the subject line was blank. His journalist's instincts, honed by years of dealing with sensitive sources, kicked in immediately. This wasn't a press release. He navigated to his encrypted email client, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy with sleep. The message body was brief, written in a terse, clinical style. Vance, your inquiries have been noted. You are operating far outside your lane. Cease all investigation and leave Nevada immediately. You are not uncovering truth. You are trespassing. The cost of persistence would be professional and personal ruin. There will be no further warning. It was signed only with the letter M. Attached was a single file, encrypted with a PGP key that matched one he'd been given by a trusted intermediary months ago for high-risk sources. His heart hammered against his ribs as he decrypted it. The file was a digital photograph. The image was grainy, shot from an awkward angle, as if hastily and secretly. The lighting was the sterile, flat white of industrial fluorescence. It showed a large, cylindrical containment tank made of thick glass or reinforced acrylic. Inside, suspended in a viscous, pale blue fluid, was a specimen. Alex leaned closer to the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The thing was biological. That much was clear. Its form was pale and vaguely bipedal, but its proportions were all wrong, too slender. The limbs too long and jointed in places that seemed unnatural. It had multiple limbs, or perhaps tendrils, coiled against its torso. The head was large and smooth, devoid of any visible facial features except for what might have been two dark, sunken pits where eyes should be. The image was slightly blurred, the focus soft, but the details that were visible were terrifying in their ambiguity. It was neither fully animal nor fully anything else. It was a biological absurdity, a pale, multi-limbed shape suspended in silent, fluidic arrest. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, washed over him. This was not a UFO photo from a dubious website. This was not a witness sketch or a blurry light in the sky. This was a piece of evidence from inside the machine itself. The clinical tone of the email, the specific threat of ruin, and this thing in a tank. It was a targeted, knowledgeable warning from someone who had access. Someone who knew what he was looking for, and knew exactly what to show him to make him stop. The rational part of his mind. The part that had clung to Dr. Evans's theories and questioned Bob Lazar's credentials. Shattered. This was not a debate about advanced aircraft. This was something else entirely. The photo electrified him. A jolt of pure, undiluted terror that was immediately followed by a surge of grim vindication. Applied silence, the redacted files, the contractor's fear, the bizarre connections to Utah. It all coalesced into a single horrifying point of focus in that tank. He wasn't being warned off by public affairs officers or corporate lawyers. He was being warned by the keepers of the secret itself. They weren't just asking him to stop. They were showing him a glimpse of what he was not allowed to see, ensuring he understood the monstrous scale of what he was touching. Alex closed the laptop the image seared onto his retinas. The motel room felt suddenly claustrophobic. Walls too thin, the silence too complete. He was no longer an observer, a journalist following a trail. He had been seen. He had been measured. And he had been put on notice. The line he had been cautiously approaching was now directly beneath his feet. He had crossed from chasing a story to becoming a part of it. The paranoia was no longer an abstract feeling. It was a physical presence in the car with him. Cold weight in his stomach that had nothing to do with the lukewarm coffee in his cup holder. Alex Vance had left the motel at dawn. The encrypted warning and its horrifying attachment burning in his mind. He needed to move, to put distance between himself and the room that suddenly felt like a target. He was 20 miles down the extraterrestrial highway. The vast, empty desert unfolding in every direction. When he first noticed the car. A dark, unmarked SUV, a Ford Expedition, sitting a quarter-mile back. It had been there since the last turnoff, maintaining a constant, precise distance. It could have been a coincidence, a rancher, or a government worker on an early start. But in the immense emptiness of the highway, any other vehicle felt like a violation. Alex slowed his rented sedan, watching his rear view. The SUV slowed. Accordingly, he accelerated. It matched his speed. His palms began to sweat against the steering wheel. This was it. The warning wasn't just words on a screen. He crested a small rise, and for a moment, the SUV disappeared from view. When it reappeared, it was closer, and a second identical vehicle had joined it, pulling out from a dust-obscured side road to fall in behind the first. They were boxing him in, a silent, professional pincer movement. His heart began to hammer, a frantic drum against his ribs. He stomped on the accelerator. The sedan's engine whined, pushing the speedometer past 90. The desert became a blur of ochre and gray. In the mirror, the two SUVs surged forward without hesitation, closing the gap with terrifying ease. They weren't chasing him. They were herding him. The lead SUV pulled into the oncoming lane, drawing alongside him. The windows were tinted opaque, but he could make out the silhouettes of two men inside. They didn't gesture, didn't shout. They just drove parallel to him, their presence an unspoken threat. The second SUV rode his bumper, so close he could no longer see its grille. Ahead, the highway made a long, gentle curve. The SUV beside him began to edge closer, its intention clear, to force him off the pavement and into the soft, treacherous sand of the shoulder. Alex gritted his teeth, his knuckles white on the wheel. He wasn't a stunt driver. He was a journalist from San Francisco. Fear and raw determination warred with a rising sense of helplessness. He saw his chance just ahead. A barely there track. Little more than twin ruts in the desert floor, leading off to the right. It was a risk. The sedan wasn't built for off-roading, but the highway was a death sentence. He waited until the last second, then yanked the wheel hard right and slammed on the brakes. The sedan skidded, tires screeching, and shot onto the dirt track, kicking up a massive plume of dust and gravel. The maneuver was sudden, amateurish, and desperate. It was also unexpected. The two SUVs shot past the turnoff, their brake lights flaring red in surprise. Alex didn't wait. He floored the accelerator, the sedan bucking and rattling violently as it tore across the uneven ground. He glanced in the mirror. The dust cloud he'd created was a thick, roiling brown wall, obscuring everything behind him. He drove for 5 minutes,
His body braced against the jarring impacts, following the track deeper into the emptiness when he finally dared to stop. The only sound was the tick of his cooling engine and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He scanned the horizon in every direction. Nothing. The desert had swallowed him whole. He was alone. Shaken, the taste of dust and fear thick in his mouth, but alone. They had wanted to crash him. They had wanted to scare him, to show him their reach and their control. They had succeeded in the first, but as his breathing slowly steadied, the fear began to crystallize into something harder, more resolved. The professional and personal ruin promised in the email now felt like a challenge. He had seen the monster in the tank. He had felt their pressure. Turning back was no longer an option. The chase had ended, but his investigation had just begun. The silence of the desert motel room was no longer peaceful. It was charged, expectant. Alex Vance sat at the small table. A topographic map of the Groom Lake Range spread out before him, held down at the corners by his laptop. A coffee mug, and the unnaturally heavy metallic shard from Clyde Barker's ranch. The blurred, terrifying image from the encrypted email was a ghost in the room, a constant reminder of what was at stake. They had warned him. They had chased him. They had shown him just enough to make the rational world feel like a thin veneer. He could still walk away. He could drive back to Las Vegas, catch a flight to San Francisco, and write a sanitized article about the culture of secrecy in the American Southwest. It would be a respectable piece. It might even win an award. But it would be a lie by omission. He had held a piece of the impossible in his hand. He had seen a biological absurdity in a government tank. The journalistic ethics that had always been his compass now pointed in only one direction. Forward. He needed to see it for himself. Not through the lens of a guide for self, witness's memory, or anonymous source's photograph, but with his own eyes. The map was a gift from his anonymous source, the one who had corroborated Lazarus' logistics. It was a detailed geological survey map, but it had been annotated by hand with meticulous, precise notes in faint pencil. A dotted line traced a path through a labyrinth of arroyos and canyons, south of the Tikaboo Peak observation point, a route that allegedly avoided the most concentrated sensor fields. Tiny script indicated shift change times for perimeter patrols, based on old but presumably still relevant patterns. The destination was a high ridge overlooking the central complex of the base, a vantage point marked with a small, precise X. The plan was reckless. It was arguably insane. Trespassing on a military installation, especially this one, was a federal crime that carried severe penalties. But it was also, in its own dangerous way, plausible. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was a surgical incursion, using the land itself as cover. He would go in at night during the window of the annotated shift change. He would travel on foot, using night vision goggles he'd purchased from an army surplus store in Vegas. He would take no phone, no electronic device that could be tracked, only a high-resolution digital camera with a powerful telephoto lens, its GPS and wireless functions physically disabled. His motivation was a tangled knot of professional duty and personal obsession. This was the story of a lifetime, the kind of truth that redefined realities. But it was more than that. It was for Clyde Barker, living his life in the shadow of a silent threat. It was for the fear in the anonymous truck driver's voice. It was a refusal to be intimidated, to be made an unperson before he'd even begun. He traced the route on the map with his finger one final time, committing the turns, the elevation changes, the estimated distances to memory. He would burn the map after. He felt a cold clarity settle over him, the
the same focus he felt when closing in on a corporate fraud, but magnified 100-fold by the stakes. This wasn't about getting a scoop. It was about bearing witness. He was crossing a line from which there was no return, trading the safety of the observer for the peril of the participant. He took a deep breath, folded the map, and slipped it into his pocket. The plan was set.
The truth was waiting. The desert night was a vast black dome pierced by 1,000,000 cold, indifferent stars.
There was no moon, and the darkness was absolute. A tangible presence that swallowed sound and distance. Alex Vance moved through it like a ghost, his every sense screaming, his body coiled with a tension that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. He had parked the sedan 5 miles back, hidden in a deep arroyo off a forgotten mining road. The hike to the ridge had been a nerve-shredding exercise in silence and patience. The annotated map was a burning secret in his pocket. Each step, validation, or a betrayal of the source who had provided it. The night vision goggles cast the world in a grainy, monochrome green, turning juniper bushes into looming specters, and making the uneven ground a treacherous puzzle. 3 times he froze, dropping to his belly in the cold sand as the low thrum of a distant patrol helicopter passed overhead, its navigation lights winking like malevolent eyes. He held his breath until the sound faded into the immense silence, his heart hammering against the hard-packed earth. The map had been right about their pattern. The final approach was the worst. The ridge was steep, a crumbling face of shale and loose rock that seemed to groan with every cautious handhold. He moved with agonizing slowness, each dislodged pebble sounding like a landslide in the crushing quiet. The cold air burned in his lungs, but he dared not breathe too heavily. Reaching the crest, he lay perfectly still for a long minute, scanning the expanse below through the goggles. The facility was a sprawl of distant, geometric lights, runways, hangars, and administrative buildings laid out with brutal efficiency. It was both smaller and larger than he had imagined. A compact city of secrets shining in the middle of nowhere. The silence was broken only by the faint, electric hum of the bass and the blood pounding in his ears. This was it. The vantage point. The X on the map. Slowly, with movements that felt deafeningly loud, he shrugged off his backpack. His fingers, numb with cold and adrenaline, fumbled with the zipper. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was his camera. He assembled the long telephoto lens with practiced, silent efficiency, his hands steadying as he fell into the familiar ritual of his profession. He mounted the rig on a compact tripod, keeping its profile low against the skyline. Settling behind the viewfinder, he began to scan. The powerful lens brought the distant lights into sharp, clinical focus. He could see the individual windows of a guard tower, the closed doors of a massive hangar, a lone truck moving slowly along a perimeter road. It was all so normal, so mundane. It could have been any airbase in the world. But the feeling was all wrong. The air itself felt charged, watchful. This was no ordinary place. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, a counterpoint to the eerie quiet. He was a trespasser in the sanctum of the unknown, a mouse staring into the workings of a vast, terrible claw. He panned the camera slowly, methodically, every nerve ending alive, waiting for the clock to strike. The desert night was a void, the cold seeping through Alex's jacket as he lay motionless on the ridge. Through the viewfinder of his camera, the base below was a grid of sterile light, a circuit board etched into the ancient darkness. He had been scanning for what felt like ours. His body numb. His mind a tight coil of focus and dread. The rational part of him, the part that had clung to Dr. Evans's theories, whispered that this was folly, that he would see nothing but the mundane workings of a secretive airfield. Then, something shifted. Between two distant hangars, the air itself seemed to warm. It was a subtle shimmer, a heat haze distortion, but the night was cold. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He tightened his grip on the camera, his finger hovering over the shutter button. The shimmer coalesced into a shape. It was a disc, smooth and seamless, its surface a dull, non-reflective gray that seemed to drink the light from the hangars around it. It was utterly silent. There was no roar of engines, no whine of turbines, no rush of displaced air. It simply glided, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace between the buildings, as if the laws of momentum and inertia were mere suggestions. Its movement was all wrong. It didn't bank or turn. It slid, changing direction in perfect, sharp angles, without slowing or accelerating. One moment, it was moving parallel to a runway. The next, it was drifting perpendicular, its motion impossibly smooth and precise. It was a thing of pure geometry given form, a silent ballet of physics defying intent. This was no aircraft, no drone, no black project, prototype from the mind of any human engineer. The Blackbird was a masterpiece of speed and altitude, but it was a known quantity, a product of aerodynamics and thrust. This was something else entirely. It moved through the air like a stone through water, without any visible means of propulsion, without any sound at all. The only evidence of its passage was the subtle warping of light around its edges, a visual echo of its impossible presence. Alex's skepticism, the foundation of his entire career, shattered. It didn't crumble, it vaporized. The world tilted on its axis. The theories, the debates, the redactions, it all fell away, rendered meaningless by the silent, gliding reality in his viewfinder. This was the truth. This was what they were hiding. A wave of pure, unadulterated shock washed over him, followed instantly by a fierce, blazing vindication. Clyde had been right. The Tsar, for all his flaws, had been right. The anonymous source had been right. His hands trembled, but his training took over. He fired the camera's motor drive, the shutter clicking rapidly, capturing frame after frame of the impossible. The sound was obscenely loud in the desert silence. He was documenting it. He had it. The disc completed its silent traverse and began to descend toward a large circular pad set into the ground between the hangars. There was no door, no opening. The pad itself slid aside without a sound, revealing a dark, illuminated shaft descending into the earth. The craft hovered for a final second above the void, then dropped into the opening with the same silent, controlled precision. The pad slid shut, sealing the desert floor once more. The entire event had lasted less than 30 seconds. Alex lay there, gasping, the camera still pressed to his face, staring at the now empty spot where reality had just broken. The silence rushed back in, deeper and more profound than before. He had come for evidence, and he had found it. He had seen the secret of Groom Lake with his own eyes, and in that moment, he understood that his life would never be the same. He was no longer a journalist investigating a story. He was a witness to the impossible, and he had to get his proof to the world. The descent from the ridge was a blur of adrenaline and terror. Alex moved on, pure instinct, his body operating on autopilot while his mind replayed the silent, impossible glide of the disc on an endless, shattering loop. He scrambled down the rocky slope, not caring about the noise now, the camera clutched to his chest like a holy relic. The images stored on its memory card were more valuable than his life. He hit the flat desert floor and ran, his legs pumping, lungs burning in the cold, thin air. The rational part of his brain, the part that had just been obliterated and was struggling to reform, screamed that he was making a target of himself. But the primal, victorious part, the journalist who had just captured the story of the millennium, drowned it out. He had to get to the core. He had to get the evidence out. He never saw them coming. One moment he was running through the scrub, the dark bulk of his rental car finally visible in the starlight 100 yards ahead. The next, powerful headlights flared to life from two parked vehicles he had missed completely, pinning him in their blinding glare. He skidded to a halt, throwing up an arm to shield his eyes. His heart seizing in his chest. Doors opened silently. Not the heavy, armored doors of military vehicles, but the smooth, quiet clicks of luxury sedans. Figures emerged from the glare, backlit and indistinct. They didn't run. They simply walked toward him with a calm, unhurried purpose. There were 4 of them, all wearing dark, impeccably tailored suits. They were the men from Clyde's story. Alex turned to run, but 2 more appeared from the darkness behind him, cutting off his retreat. They moved with an unnerving coordination, a practiced choreography of containment. They didn't shout commands. They didn't draw weapons. Their silence was more terrifying than any threat. One of the men, older than the others, with a face that was all sharp angles and cold composure, stepped forward. Alexander Vance, he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like a machine reading a script. You're coming with us. There was no point in resisting. They surrounded him, their movements efficient and impersonal. One of them took the camera from his numb fingers with the detached care of an evidence technician. Another patted him down, finding his wallet, his recorder, his keys. They missed the metallic shard, still wrapped in cloth in his deepest pocket. It was a small, meaningless victory. He was guided not to a military truck, but into the plush, silent interior of one of the black sedans. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing him in. The interior smelled of leather and antiseptic. They drove for what felt like an hour, but in the featureless desert, time and distance were impossible to gauge. They eventually stopped at a nondescript single-story concrete building that could have been a utility station or a remote office. Inside was brutally utilitarian. White walls, fluorescent lights, a metal table, and 2 chairs. The interrogation was not what he had feared. There was no violence, no bright lights shone in his face. Bright lights shone in his face. The older man, who never gave a name, sat across from him. He placed Alex's recorder and notepad on the table between them. You have seen things that are not for public consumption, the man said. His tone conversational, almost bored. This is not a matter of national security to present the way you understand it. It is a matter of societal security. The unprepared mind cannot process this information. It causes panic, disorder. He spoke for 20 minutes, his monologue a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He never admitted to anything specific, never mentioned a craft or extraterrestrials. Instead, He talked about advanced research, unconventional physics, and the duty of responsible stewardship. He framed their secrecy not as a cover-up, but as a solemn, necessary burden. He then outlined the consequences of Alex's actions with the chilling precision of a lawyer. He detailed the legal statutes Espionage Act, theft of government property, trespassing on a restricted installation, and the mandatory minimum sentences attached to each. He mentioned the Chronicle, its parent company, the potential for crippling lawsuits that would destroy the paper, and everyone Alex worked with. He spoke of Alex's family, his friends, the total and irreversible professional and personal ruin that would follow any attempt to publish his story.
The evidence you believe you have no longer exists, the man said, his eyes cold and final. The world you return to will not believe you. You will be a laughingstock, a ruined man chasing fantasies. The choice is simple. Forget what you saw. Continue your life and be thankful for our restraint, or pursue this and become nothing. They drove him back to his rental car, which was waiting exactly where he left it, keys in the ignition. The men in suits got back into their sedans and drove away, vanishing into the pre-dawn darkness as silently as they had appeared. Alex sat in the driver's seat, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He was physically free. They hadn't touched him, but he had never felt more imprisoned. Their warning wasn't a threat of death. It was a promise of erasure. They had looked into his life and shown him exactly how they would dismantle it, piece by piece. They hadn't just taken his camera. They had taken his future. He was alone in the vast, empty desert, the keeper of a truth that had become a curse. The motel room was a tomb. The drawn curtains sealed out the Nevada dawn, leaving Alex Vance in a perpetual stale twilight that matched his internal state. He sat at the small, scarred desk, his laptop open, its glow the only source of light. The air smelled of dust, cheap coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline long since burned away, leaving only a hollow, aching fatigue. His body was a collection of protest-strained muscles from the flight and capture, a raw throat from breathing cold, thin air, a tremor in his hands that wouldn't quite subside. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological aftershock. The image of the silent, gliding disc was seared onto the back of his eyelids, a permanent loop of impossible physics and world-shattering truth. And superimposed over it were the cold, bored eyes of the man in the suit, calmly outlining the total destruction of his life. He began to write. The article poured out of him not in a rush of excitement, but with the slow, deliberate precision of a coroner conducting an autopsy. He started with the legend itself, the hushed tones in the little alley, the vast, watchful silence of the desert. He introduced Clyde Barker not as a crackpot, but as a solid, credible man whose life was fractured by a silent, triangular enigma, and a polite, terrifying man who enforced silence. He described the metallic shard, its unnatural weight and coolness, a physical mystery he could no longer test. He presented the official narrative with scrupulous fairness. He detailed his research in the archives, the dry, redacted memos that acknowledged the base but hid its soul. He gave full voice to Dr. Evans's rational, compelling black jet hypothesis, explaining how advanced human technology could account for so much of the phenomenon. He laid out the theory with the respect it deserved. Then, with the same even-handed tone, he introduced the flaws. The security guard's account of non-human hieroglyphics and biohazard protocols. The complex, problematic claims of Bob Lazar, carefully separating the verifiable details of facility security from the unverifiable science. The anonymous corroboration that spoke of a separate, deeper secret.
the chilling pattern that connected Rune Lake to other sites of high strangeness, suggesting a research network of terrifying scope. He wrote about the warning, the encrypted email, the blurred photograph of the biological specimen that defied classification. He described the chase on the extraterrestrial highway, the professional, methodical pressure applied to scare him off. He did not write about his incursion. He did not describe what he saw. That evidence was gone, and to claim it without proof would be to walk directly into their trap, to become the laughingstock they promised. He would be. Instead, he presented the totality of the evidence. The earthly and the extraordinary, the rational and the irrational, and let them sit side by side in stark, uncomfortable contrast. He showed how the government's own actions, the extreme secrecy, the witness intimidation, the psychological manipulation were the fuel for the very speculation they claimed to abhor. His conclusion was not about little green men or recovered spacecraft. It was about the nature of the secret itself. He wrote that the true conspiracy was not necessarily the hiding of extraterrestrial life, but the deliberate and masterful cultivation of mystery. It was a smokescreen so thick and pervasive that the truth, whatever it might be, a terrifying new physics, a non-human intelligence, or something beyond current comprehension, remained forever hidden in plain sight. The government's greatest achievement was not the technology it may have reverse-engineered, but the perfect, impenetrable veil of uncertainty it had woven around it. They had made the truth fundamentally unknowable, and in doing so, they had protected it absolutely. He saved the file, encrypting it with a key only his editor knew. He would send it, not because he believed it would change the world, but because it was his duty to bear witness. The men in suits had taken his proof, but they could not take his observation. He was a keeper of secrets now, but he was also a keeper of the question. The article ended not with a period, but with the echoing, unresolved tension of the unanswered. The truth was out there, vast and terrifying, but it might never be known. And Alex Vance, the skeptical journalist, had finally learned that some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved, but abysses to be acknowledged. He closed the laptop. The room was silent. The desert outside and all it contained, waiting